Okay, welcome back to Liquid Lunch. We're here with Bruce Bell, historian. 13 years you've been a historian?
Writing for the Bulletin, yes.
Writing for the Bulletin.
Yes, I was a historian the day I was born, I think.
Okay.
I think it's genetic with people.
Well, it might be genetic, and this is Jeanette.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think history is really cool.
Well, I think anything, you obviously listen to the passion you have. That's a genetic thing. It's something you're born with.
It's also a cultural thing. I'm very
and you're very passionate about it.
Well, okay, what's interesting, okay, so we're just coming on, right? And we just discovered, just before we came on, Jeanette is from Belleville, of course.
Yeah.
I am from Welland, and you're from Sudbury.
Sudbury, yes.
So here we are. We all came to Toronto, and here we are.
500 people a day move to this city.
Wow, no wonder they're building so many condos.
500 people a day?
A day move to Toronto.
What's the appeal?
Why did you move here, Jeanette?
I'll tell you why I moved here, because I was forced to move here. No,
I was forced too.
Forced. I was like, you're 18, get out of here, because I don't want you in a small town. You'll never meet a Jewish guy. That's why I left Belleville.
I love Sudbury. I have a passion for Sudbury. I really love my hometown, and I try and go back as much as I can, and I write sometimes for their local paper when I can. 200 people lived here in the year 1800.
Only
200 people.
In 1800.
So when you think, and then by 1900, we had 500,000 people. So in that mere 100 years, how fast this city grew. Mm-hmm. And then again, by 1950, we hit the million people mark. And now we're, the GTA 5 million. They say in 25 years, we'll be up, 10 million people. And if the world doesn't end on Saturday, I think the Golden Horseshoe, Niagara Falls, Toronto, Hamilton, is all going to just join together.
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Well,
big mega
So
city.
you
Kinda
think
is
we'll be
already,
bigger than New York
almost.
then?
Yeah, already. You think of New York, especially Manhattan. Toronto is far larger than Manhattan. Manhattan's this shoved-in little island with enormous buildings on it, where Toronto is growing at a remarkable rate. And when you look at the history of our city from the year 1800, when there were 10 streets downtown and 200 people, sometimes maybe 4 people living in one street, by 1820, 2,000 people, nothing much happened until the coming of the railroad, and that's what changed the course of our history, was the railway. There was a choice between the railway choosing Hamilton over Toronto.
Yeah, I guess at one time there was a real serious rivalry between Hamilton and Toronto.
Oh, sure.
To be the center of the
yes.
Ontario universe.
And they almost won. Hamilton was, really willing to give the railroad the. You could be right on the water. Where here there was an argument. There was a beautiful park along the harbor front at one time in the city before the railway came, when Front Street fronted the lake. Everything south of Front Street is the landfill. The garbage of the city was just dumped there, creating the harbor. So the railway said,
really?
and it's every time they dig up, when they put a new condo on the lakefront, they dig up this garbage. They dig up not just banana peels and Coke bottles, but they dig up the remains of horses. All the horses, when the horse town was run by horses, all thrown into the water. Trains are in there, boats. There's tons of garbage. And that's how they recycled back then. They just threw it into the water.
The good old days.
Wow. No wonder
And plus the
Ontario
building
is
of
so
the subway, all that's in the water too, all that earth.
And they're still putting it out on the Leslie Street.
Yeah,
strip,
and they
right?
call it clean fill, and I'm sure it is. I'm pretty sure they're a little more careful, but there was no regulation until 1969 of what you could put in the Great Lakes. You could just open sewer was just poured into the Great Lakes.
So are you? One thing I was just you said, and I wanted to ask you: are you saying that originally what is now Front Street was the tip of Lake
Well, that's
Ontario?
why they call it Front Street, because it fronted the lake.
Wow. So would that be like where the number 2 highway continued?
Number 2 highway?
Yeah, like Lakeshore.
That was Kingston Road, I guess, was number 2 highway, right?
Well, Kingston Road, King Street. That at one time was the heart. Bloor Street used to be Lake Ontario at one time, and St. Clair was Lake Ontario. The lake has receded naturally. Also, the Niagara Escarpment is the old shoreline, which St. Clair Avenue is. But that was 10,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, it was Bloor Street, and by the time the British arrived here in 1793, Front Street was the lake. Ontario.
How did Toronto become the city that it is? Originally, it was Fort York.
Originally, it was, of course, First Nations. Toronto meant in Huron, it means meeting place. And in Mohawk, and forgive our Mohawk listeners, Toronto, I think it's pronounced with a K, means sticks in the water. There are actually two meanings to it. Sticks in the water, meeting place. But when Britain arrived here in 1793, they changed all the Indian-sounding names to very British names. So the old village of Toronto, which really had no one was really living here. A lot of the First Nations were coming down from further north to fish in April and May, but they didn't build anything here. And the French were here for 100 years. They built a fort called Fort Rouillé on the grounds of the CNE.
It's still there, or a remnant of it?
Burnt out remains are. They were there for 100 years. This was all Louis XIV's land.
Really?
Versailles. Have you ever been to Versailles?
Oh, yes, I have. And
Beautiful.
It is gorgeous.
And that was all. This was all his land. He was very aware of this place. He
So
knew.
what is now Fort Henry was originally a French fort.
Fort Henry?
Oh no, that's in Kingston.
Kingston. Fort York.
Was originally.
That was always a British fort. The
Okay.
French fort was on the grounds of the CNE.
It's still
close,
there. You
close
can go
by,
there.
Yeah.
There's a plaque. There's a little building
There's a monument there, yes.
of the original French fort.
But very small. No more than
Yeah.
maybe 20 people were ever there at a time. And it was voyageurs, coming down from French River, down the Toronto Passage with fur trading.
Wow.
So it wasn't until 1793 that Britain finally established a real town where St. Lawrence Market is today. That's where Toronto was founded.
And I
That
guess
was
they
the
were
original part of Toronto.
Is right there, St. Lawrence Market,
the old town.
Old Town.
And I guess that was done in conjunction, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, but that's a little right after the American Revolution,
Yes, I mean,
right after Wolfe's conquest of Quebec, and it was
Wolfe's conquest first. They died, of course, 1759, and that's really when Quebec became British, and sadly, as they would say, Celine Dion never says she's a Canadian; she's always a Quebecois, and Niagara-on-the-Lake becomes the capital of Ontario, or Upper Canada, where we are.
Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Niagara-on-the-Lake, and it was known as Newark back then. And the American Revolution happens in 1776, which is as many stairs in the CN Tower, 1776.
Wow.
And that is when 35% of our population is now American, because thousands and thousands, over 100,000 Americans who did not want to live under a president, they wanted to be loyal to the king, and they were the United Empire Loyalists. They're the ones that came up here.
Interestingly enough, I mentioned I come from Belleville, and it's a real Empire Loyalist
Oh,
town.
yes,
And
very
I
much
think
so.
it was started in 1763, around there too.
Yes.
And I know a little bit about it, other in that it was rivaling Ottawa to be at one time considered the capital of
Kingston
Ontario.
or Belleville?
Belleville.
That I did not know.
Yeah, it was. But I'm curious about Toronto. I know, where the distillery is right now? Was that the original port of Toronto?
No, that was the end of the old harbor. That was at the that was the last factory at the very end. And ironically, it's the only one that's survived. There were over 100 factories along Front Street.
So the cobblestones and all that they have there that they use for the movie shoots, are they authentic, or were
80% of those stones are original, and they are mostly from Ohio. When the coal ships were coming over in the 19th century that's where we got most of our coal from, to blast our furnaces, they would put a layer of bricks in the bottom of ships to ballast, to keep them afloat so the coal wouldn't shift during the storm. So when they'd unload the coal, they'd unload all those bricks and they would pave our streets with them. And if you go to the distillery, you will see every so often you will see a stone that has that stamped in it, the Canton, Ohio Brickworks.
Wow.
And you will see that.
Was Toronto built to be more American or more British, like a London type of town?
Originally, yes, very colonial wooden town, not much to write home about. It wasn't until, again, the coming of the railroad, 1850, that the population and the building boom happened, and we started to look like London. All of our buildings and banks took on this very beautiful London look, as of St. Lawrence Hall has today. If you go there on King Street, that's a very British-looking building. But by 1900, a lot of those buildings were gone, replaced with very French-style buildings. Paris, as we know today, most of the Paris, France, was built all in the 1870s in a 10-year period. Baron Haussmann, the great French planner of Paris, was told by Napoleon III, tear down medieval Paris, all gone. 70% of Paris was wiped off the map, and the Paris we know was rebuilt in the 1870s. So this caused a revolution in architecture around the world. Everyone wanted to look like the Second Empire style, as they call it. Well, Toronto embraced that look. And they were sending architects over to Paris, coming back with drawings and plans. And so by 1900, the New York Times had dubbed Toronto the Paris on the Lake. Some of the most beautiful French Second Empire style buildings. Unfortunately, they're all gone.
All of them?
There's maybe a handful. There's
Wow.
one, if you go to the Irish Embassy pub on the corner of Yonge and Wellington, is one of the last remaining real Second Empire style buildings, and it's the last of a whole block of, if you look at it from across the street, you'll see that beautiful French look. Henry Langley was our great architect of the 19th century who built many of this beautiful French style. Also, the C&E, the remaining buildings out there, all done in that very French exposition style that was all the rage at the turn of the century. But Toronto, after the Second World War, tore down 25,000 buildings in the downtown core. I mean, 500 buildings were torn down to build the TD Centre, 700 buildings to build the Eaton Centre, and we lost it all. It's all gone.
Not to mention, I've seen some of those photos of, for example, the armory that was right here where the
Yes,
City
the
Hall.
big
And
castle.
it looked like a beautiful building.
Beautiful building. And people would say, why did we allow that to happen? Well, Frederick Gardner, who they named the Gardner Expressway after, he was our Metro chairman. He was called Big Daddy Big Daddy Freddie, and he was the guy in control of this. And he, him and his cronies just said, get rid of every old building in the city. I want a much more modern city, the one we have today. And a lot of the people who were coming into our city were, immigrants, and they did not want to complain. They were quite happy to be here. And yes, there was a bit of there was no real public outcry that he was demolishing the downtown core. And some people said, just that you really shouldn't do that. You should maybe save something. And he was ready to knock down, of course, Old City Hall. They were going to, and Osgood Hall was going to be slated for
Those
demolition.
are beautiful buildings.
And after the Second World War, every building in the city was covered in coal dust and grime. You couldn't see the true beauty behind them. You had to clean them first. So luckily, the ones that were cleaned, the rest of us got to see just how beautiful the city is underneath all that coal dust.
And yet, it's funny because Toronto has often been criticized as an ugly corporate town, whereas Montreal gets, the Euro-style beauty. And here you're pointing out that, in fact, we had French-style beauty, too. And then it seems
French,
like they
Italian,
took it away.
we had some of the most beautiful buildings that, could rival anything in Rome, London, Paris, Munich, Germany. We had a Masonic hall on Toronto Street at one time, was built to kind of look like the City Hall of Munich. I mean, there was... When you look at
I wonder why would they do that? Take away all that art, history, culture,
what they
and
should have
European
done
flair.
is built a newer town a bit westward. They should have left the old town, the 19th century town, intact and built a new financial core where the Sky Dome is, like that whole area, which was all just land that was, not much was on there, railroad and a lot of old sheds. They really should have built a bigger, which Montreal did. They saved old Montreal and built Montreal, but also lost a lot of buildings too. I mean, during their Expo 67, when they were building the freeways going right through Montreal, they lost as much as we did, as did New York City. New York lost a phenomenal amount of buildings. I mean, we're not the only one. It's just very obvious with ours because our downtown core is very beautiful. I mean, I have no problem with. I love the TD Centre. I mean, it's Mies van der Rohe, a great architect of the 20th century. But they should have saved Toronto Street. If you've ever seen old pictures of Toronto Street, it's a very small street from King to Adelaide, very small. That was known as the Imperial Street of Toronto. That was one of the most stunning examples of this Second Empire style, that they were building extraordinary buildings on that street. That's why the street is also very wide. If you've been on Toronto Street, you'll notice it's a much wider street, because at the head of the street, they built the General Post Office of Toronto, built by Henry Langley, the guy who loved France, and he built it to look like the Grand Opera House in Paris. That old, beautiful opera house with a big dome on it. He built it to remind people just how magnificent architecture can be. And it was torn down in 1960, and the whole street just kind of is gone, unfortunately.
Although I think Conrad Black's number 10.
Yes, and that's still there, and that just went under a beautiful renovation by the new owners. I mean, that's still there. The Rosewater Club is there, the old Consumers Gas. That's there, and there's also, next to that is an old bank that's still, there's 3 buildings left on that street out of the 20 or so that were there.
Do you think we're gaining a new... I think what happened was people just, out with the old, in with the new.
And quickly.
They didn't really have an appreciation for the old. Everybody just loved the new. The new was good. Progress is good.
Well, no one lived downtown either in the 1960s. There were no BIAs. There were no... people living there. Everyone lived in the suburbs. It was a very corporate town until 1980. No one lived downtown. It wasn't zoned for that. So yes, the corporations could put their own banks up and just demolish things, and no outcry. Today it's better, but we still lose a lot. I mean, fire destroyed the old Empress Hotel on Yonge Street, where the old Sam the Record Man is. See how we're aging ourselves? I mean, how quickly this generation now, who are becoming 16, 17 years old, will have no recollection of the Yonge Street that we knew just 10 years ago. And again, how fast it's grown.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned the suburbs, and it seems like the suburbs are an integral part of Toronto's city. How long have they? I mean, they've been growing. Look at Mississauga. Sure. It took in 4 towns, made it is now one.
That's right.
For old towns like Streetsville and Port Credit and what have you. And I believe, wasn't it Etobicoke was the first suburb of Toronto?
Well, I mean, indirectly, Yorkville was a suburb at one time.
Oh, it was?
1880. I mean, that was one of the first amalgamations, was when a lot of those little towns were joined together. I mean, Etobicoke, sure. I mean, even Mississauga, some of the old parts of that is Cawthra Road area. The Cawthra people, the rich family, the Cawthras, lived in a beautiful home. That was all their land at one time, and they had a business downtown on Frederick Street, where there's actually Frederick in front. They had an apothecary, a drugstore there, and they had this big mansion in Mississauga. So people were living on the outskirts, and what we now consider, even Don Mills, people were living there since the very beginning. Right, there was
the beautiful homes in Don Mills. One now that is the restaurant, what's that place called? David Duncan House. The Duncan family were, and also the Heintzman House was part of Thornhill. From those, they were piano makers, and that was a gorgeous. That's a gorgeous mansion that was
always
saved
living in the suburbs.
In Markham. Yeah, Markham, I think.
Markham's as old as Toronto.
And Thornhill too is quite old.
It all happened at the same time. That people also, as soon as they made some money in the town here, they started buying land up north to get away. Like Casa Loma, that whole area up at St. Clair. I mean, that was countryside. Even in 1900, that was known as the country.
And Forest Hill Village must have been like a little village in the forest.
That's right, and hence the name. Like Rosedale. I mean, Rosedale was another about 1850, 1860. It's one of the oldest rich areas of the town. And Jarvis Street, I mean, that was considered country around Jarvis and Wellesley at one time. That was in the 1850s. That was country.
And they had some beautiful homes on
Oh, my goodness.
Sherbourne, too, had
Sherbourne, makes you so mad, I'm telling you. It does.
Just to think about all the stuff we've lost.
And, we have to save what we have, what little there is. I mean, Sherbourne Street, the old James Cooper mansion, is now a condominium. They added a big tower to the back of it. That's built in the Second Empire style. That's just south of Bloor. It used to be the old Knights of Columbus Hall. Just a magnificent, beautiful home. And it was actually, they moved it from, 30 feet from the back, and they moved it closer to the street and put a big tower on the back of it.
So it seems to be that seems to be a trend where they're taking the old buildings And instead of just tearing them down, they're actually incorporating them into the design of the new building.
And that's okay. You can't have everything. There's two banks on Yonge Street.
I hate that expression, to be honest with you.
What?
Can't have everything.
No, and you just have to go and geez, because some, really purists say, no, you must save the old building and keep it exactly as it is. Well, that's not practical living in a great big huge city like Toronto that's moving constantly. The old has to catch up to the new, and we must save what we do have. Now, we do the Elgin Winter Garden, that's pretty much intact.
Yeah, that's a beautiful place.
We're so lucky to have that, Ontario heritage. But the two banks north of that, the old Bank of Commerce and the old Toronto Dominion Bank, they've been sitting there empty for as long as I've lived in this city. I've been here 40 years, and they've just been boarded up. Two of the most beautiful examples of French style and Italian style. Those tiny little banks? They're small, and they were built about 1800. One has a big dome on it. The other one, the big columns in front of it, and they're just sitting there boarded up.
Just over on Yonge Street, across from the Eaton Centre?
Yes, just north of Queen, just north of the Elgin Winter Garden. And that's the new passion I have, is to, save those, because they're going to be gone, and then...
Well, they're not going to tear them down, are
but
they?
You never know.
They could crumble. They could burn. People aren't looking after them.
They could become condos.
Rats. Oh, listen,
that's okay.
anything.
Yeah.
Put a coffee shop in there. Just open them up. They're boarded up, and they're just going to crumble and fall to the street, and we won't have them anymore.
So, of everything you know about Toronto, and it's pretty evident you know a lot. You've obviously devoted a great segment of your time and life mission to learning about Toronto. I'd like to ask two questions. The first is, can you tell us maybe one thing that we as Torontonians, I guess we're all Torontonians now, don't know about Toronto, like a mystery about Toronto that we don't know, that it's kind of like a juicy tidbit that we should know. Something maybe they tried to cover up.
There is the old legend of the mass grave of about 3,000 bodies buried right in the middle of the city behind St. James Cathedral. That there's a mass grave of cholera victims that were just dumped into a big hole back in the 1830s, 1840s. There was no time to really find a proper grave for them. They couldn't bury them individually, and cholera was spreading really fast, so they opened up this big grave and they put all those bodies in there, and they're still there. And after a rainfall, if you go into St. James Park, as it has been lately, bits of bones still rise to the surface.
Oh, no. Really?
Really?
Then that's St. James Anglican on the corner of Church and King?
Yes.
Which is actually a very beautiful church.
Beautiful church.
And I don't know how old it is, but they obviously left it intact.
That's the fifth church to stand on that site. Actually, George III himself looked on an empty map of York before anything was built here, and they asked him, where do you want your church? And he said, right there. And he signed the document, and that's in the archives of that church.
So is that an original standing building, or has it been doctored
That's the
up?
fifth one.
Fifth one.
The one before that burnt down during the Great Fire of 1849, which destroyed the old town of Toronto. And that was the one there today was opened in 1853.
Oh.
Was the one that burnt, was it as big? Or?
Almost, yeah. Almost as big. Wow. It held 1,000 people. Wow. And that was built, that was the fourth one to stand on that site, and it stood for 10 years. But this Great Fire of 1849 was devastating. No one died, thankfully. Actually, one man did die. But it really destroyed all the old wooden buildings of downtown Toronto. And it was after that fire they said no more wooden buildings are to be built in the city. That's why you don't see them, because of that fire.
I guess that makes sense.
Which is great, because, these buildings are better.
What was your other question?
I lost track. My other question would be, where do you see Toronto going? Like right now, I think it's become very world famous, and there's a lot of factors to that. Listen. And a lot of celebrities come here and what have you. A lot of movies are made here. Where do you see Toronto going? What's the next step?
I mean, Toronto is becoming a mecca, a tourist mecca. I mean, I also run a walking tour company, and I'm working every day of the year, 365 days a year. I mean, it's just constant. People are coming to this city for different reasons, not just, to come to the CN Tower or Fort York, as, we did when we were younger. I mean, this city is growing so fast, and so many wonderful undiscovered areas. I mean, I love taking tourists to Baldwin Village, which is off the map, near the AGO. just near the art gallery, one street north of Dundas, a great little street full of wonderful restaurants.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
a real
I
hidden
Can't believe
gem.
you haven't.
I went to
I
a
can't
Thai
either, my
restaurant once
goodness.
on Baldwin Street.
It's what Yorkville probably looked like before
Yeah.
the renovation when all the hippies lived there. I love Baldwin.
Yeah.
I love Baldwin Village more than I like Kensington Market, but I like Baldwin Village much more.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wish we had more of that, though. More of that.
Yes, I absolutely agree. My new favorite non-neighborhood in the city is just around the corner here, Trinity Park,
Oh yeah.
where they have the labyrinth in the next
Oh,
to
yeah,
the
yeah,
church.
yeah.
They have the old church, built in the 1840s. You have the labyrinth. You have that river they put in there, the Fountain River.
Oh, that
That
sounds
is
good.
a beautiful, beautiful part of our city that a lot of, unless you work there, you rarely get to see.
You know what really surprises me, Bruce, is that it seems to me that there's always new neighborhoods that are emerging as kind of go-to places
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
city, and I'm thinking about the Junction, or even Queen
Definitely,
West.
sure.
Queen,
Oh.
west all the way to Roncesvalles
Yeah.
now, or Roncesvalles Village. I mean, Leslieville.
Yeah.
I mean, it just keeps
20
going
years
on and
ago,
on.
some neighborhoods you just would not go to. Look at Corktown. I mean, Parliament and King. I mean, some of those old shacks at one time were built as famine Irish shacks where you might have had 10, 20 families living in these old clapboard homes. And the ones that are still standing, they were built for maybe $800-900, 130 years ago, are now going for $500,000, $750,000. The same home. And that's the next big neighborhood is, Corktown. Yet 20 years ago, you would never want to. You didn't even want to walk through that neighborhood.
Where
No,
exactly
yeah,
is
where,
that?
yeah.
King and Parliament area.
Oh, that's called Corktown?
Yes, named for the Catholic Irish who left from County Cork in Ireland during the potato famine, where 1 million people starved to death and another 1 million come to the New World.
Okay.
And many thousands and thousands settled in Toronto.
Rontonsville, I know, is getting popular in that whole area. I have another question for you. Because of fuel prices, predictions are that instead of taking vacations, many families will be doing staycations this
Yes,
summer.
that'll be good for me.
And then they'll have time to explore
Yes.
Toronto in its entirety. I mean, you're mentioning things today I didn't even know about, and I
Right.
like to get around and see different things. So you've given me some tips on some things to see. What would be one thing if I was coming to
Yeah.
Toronto or doing my stay vacation?
Right.
What would be one thing or one area that you would say, oh, must see, and not a typical tour?
No, the St. Lawrence Market, we run a food tasting tour through the market.
Oh, that sounds nice.
And you get to have different foods from around the world inside the market, and you get to have a tour behind the scenes of the market, because that's the old city hall of the city. A lot of people don't know that Toronto's first city hall is still standing within St. Lawrence Market.
Oh,
and in
really?
the basement of that city hall is an old jail that still has the chains in the wall when it was built, before we were
Wow.
a democracy,
That'd be fun to see.
1844.
I hear Stephen Harper's getting that ready for use again.
Well, they're pumping couple $1 million into the
Yeah, and I'm
redoing Union
sure.
Station.
And Don Jail also is being redone.
Yeah, as an
Redoing all the jails.
event venue.
Yes.
Right? They're going to be renting
Yes,
it out.
yes.
That's
yes.
my first choice of
You
where I'd
know,
like
sure,
to get
and
married.
it'll
You know,
hang out.
have a great party in the jail.
No.
You know. So what are they converting the cells over to?
Well, the old courthouse, which is now Tironi's Restaurant on Adelaide, they've turned their jail cells in the basement into. There's a wine cellar in one of them, and others are washrooms, and the bars are still on the wall. It's fascinating.
It's
to
great.
go.
You should go down there, Jeanette, because I hear they even have a cask of Amontillado down there.
Really?
Yeah.
But it's not being used as a jail anymore.
No, these were
mean, how-
horrible jails at one
Right.
time.
So it must take millions of dollars to restore them to a use where people would want to see them and go and spend
Well,
money
yeah,
there.
sure. I mean, there's also underneath the King Edward Hotel, there is a unused stable that was never used because when the hotel opened in 1903, the car was slowly taking over, and Mr. Gooderham, who built the Gooderman and Worts Distillery, built the King Edward Hotel. Underneath Victoria Street is this massive, never used remains of an old stable and train station. He
Wow.
wanted to have his private train come from Union Station underneath the city right into his hotel, but it was never finished, and that is spectacular. That is
Yeah, that
underneath
sounds
the
great.
street. I've only seen it once myself. It's really there's so much that is buried beneath the city that we just don't know about.
It reminds me of that show, Cities of the Underworld. I don't know if you've seen
Yeah,
it
yeah,
on TV.
no,
I
yeah.
mean, have they done one on Toronto?
No, they haven't, and there's lots that we could do here. There's, the oldest sewer in Toronto is on George Street downtown, 1842, and that's still pretty much intact.
Wow.
That's
Now, do you show these on your walking
no,
tours?
I wish I could. I mean, I've shown a few of the abandoned ballroom at the King Eddie, the old Crystal Ballroom on the top floor, which
Oh,
is
that
a
sounds
block
nice.
long, and it
It's all crystals?
had 3 huge crystal chandeliers, which were long gone. But they have this abandoned ballroom that is one of the most beautiful rooms in the city.
At the King Eddie?
At the King
Why
Edward.
are they not using it at all?
No, they closed it in the 1970s when people's tastes were changing. People now wanted to have their weddings and banquets in country clubs. They didn't want to have them in old-fashioned ballrooms. So they closed the ballroom, completely forgotten about. The floor was the old wooden floor was sold, the chandeliers were sold. So they've opened it up a few times since then for Doors Open, Toronto Doors Open. I've done a few tours up there.
I
I did
wanted to
actually a
do one of
Mother's Day
those,
tour
actually.
up there. And it's quite something to see. And I heard that they're going to renovate it because it's a magnificent
Yeah.
room. I mean, it's 3 stories tall and a whole city block long.
Wow.
And everything old is new again, and all these walking
Oh, that
tours.
phrase you like.
Yeah, except for
You didn't like the one I said. What did I say that you
you can't have everything
Yeah,
you
that's
want.
it.
Hey,
Anyway.
Bruce, this would be, it just seems like there's so much in it to talk about, and it seems like, I just feel like
To
I've been
just
on
go
a trip
on, yeah.
down, just in
Oh, we have a
another world for
fascinating
the last
city.
half an hour.
A brilliant history.
I just want to ask you though, just before we wrap this one up, because when I'm either driving around the city or just exploring even the downtown area, there's just so much that's changing so quickly. There's so much building that's going on. It just seems like the city that we've known is disappearing before our eyes. I mean, and this goes back to what people are still coming here. You
Yes.
know? What
Yes.
kind of, I don't know, what do you have to say about that?
To say why people are coming here?
I don't know.
Now, why are they choosing Toronto as their home?
I mean, the city's changing so
Well,
quickly.
yes, of course. We are the most liberal city on earth. I mean, there is no city that can match us for the laws that we have to protect the average citizen here. I mean, we're way beyond United States and North Korea and China and France, Italy. I mean, we are so the best city when you travel and you see other places, and you come back and you just see how really well we have it here. The multicultural aspect of the city, the way that we seem to tell people, do whatever you want, but tell us why you're doing it. Don't hide. Share your culture with us. I mean, I think that's something
we're probably one of the only cities around that actually has clear-cut, diverse ethnic neighborhoods, which are known for that, like
Yes.
Chinatown, Greek Town.
Sure, and though yes, other cities do have it, but here it's not a hidden, scary thing at all. I mean, the city moves so much, and it's a very safe city. I mean, we have so much to be thankful, and people really work to get to where we are.
I was going to ask you, why do you think it is the way that it is?
After the Second World War, I think remember, we were once a very racist, segregated city, and I think a lot of people forget just how bad we were. We were, not just men and women were separate, but Catholics and Protestants and Jews. I mean, there were signs up on windows, no Jews allowed, no Catholics
Christy
allowed,
Pitts especially.
all that stuff. The
Yeah.
Nazi riots we had here. I mean, we came from a very divided, segregated city that would shock anyone if obviously we're still like that. But after the Second World War, and especially as the 60s and 70s came with terrific mayors we had, like David Crombie and John Sewell, who really took us into the next where we are today. And we had great city councilors, and we really have made an effort to no longer be that very divided and segregated city we once were. But we were there. So I always tell people, come from other places. I mean, you might think we have it really good here, but we work to get here. And I tell that to people who come from countries that are having strife right now. So, oh, you're so lucky. I said, well, we were exactly like you. We whipped women in the streets just like you did. We hanged people for treason, for saying things against the government. We were there at one time, but no longer.
Thank God for that.
Yeah. Otherwise, Jeanette would have been whipped
No, this
in the
never would
street
have happened.
a long time ago.
Jeanette would have started a revolution in the streets a long time ago.
And people like Jeanette did, and you and me.
Because
Well-
whipping I don't take to.
No,
You know?
but those handcuffs in the basement sound appealing, don't they?
Not really.
Okay. I'm
Okay.
Just joking around.
Time
Okay,
to.
Bruce, this has been great, and
Thanks.
I don't know if we can do this again, but
Sure.
we'd love to because it's been a real trip. So thank you for coming
Oh,
in
a
today.
pleasure.
And if people and you write a column
Yes,
regularly
a
in the
monthly
Bulletin.
column and books, ebooks. I got 5 ebooks coming out, and you can buy a hardcover also. But lots of ebooks, and I do tours. Go to brucebelltours.ca, or just Google Bruce Bell. I'm the first one to come up, and you can book a tour. I have tours running every day. I need at least a few weeks' notice, because we're so heavily booked. I do all areas of, the downtown core, St. Lawrence Market and University of Toronto, Kensington and Chinatown Distillery, the Brickworks we just added to our tours, which are fabulous in the Don Valley. I do bus tours, walking tours, and we fly to New York 4 times a year and do walking tours in New York and Chicago also.
Oh, that's
Fantastic.
great.
All right.
All right, thank you very
Sounds
much.
like
so much.
fun. I
Thanks.
would like to take one of your tours.
Please do.
Yeah. BruceBellTours.ca.
Yes.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Nice
Okay.
meeting you.
We're going to take a little break now.
And we'll
Then we're
be
going to come
right
back. Mark Lippman is
with
here,
Mark Lippman.
paramedic.
Yes.
more.
We're going to get
We'll
some
be right
great
back.
knowledge on that CPR today. Are we?
Come and smear me with the branches from that tree. Hyssop dipped in innocent blood to make me clean. Let an old man's broken bones once more rejoice. Absalom.